I am. I'm going to be talking about education. I work at the Department of Education, so my disclaimer is that no statement I make in this presentation is being made in my job, in my professional capacity. But also I do kind of know what I talk about, so that's the balance we're striking. So in terms of education debates, I'm going to go through three things. First, I'm going to talk about school. It's really in order. I'll talk about school, I'll talk about tertiary education, and then I'll talk about academia or like postgrad research. Yeah, cool, let's get into it. School. First thing I want to note is just about empirical reality in education, because a lot of school-style debates, or not school-style debates, debates about school, are really, I think, empirical questions, like about what type of school system we should have. And usually there's a lot of research on them, and it's relatively controversial in the real world. People often ask me, like, is there, when you're working at the department, do you like get any kind of debate topics that are new and novel? And the answer is not really. Like, a lot of the things that are just real life policy questions are also chestnut debates. So that is to say, you will often get kind of real researched policy questions as pretty simple debates. But the note I would have is, like, when you're reading about these things, you want to read widely for the reason that educational research is very, very complex. It's got lots of factors that feed into it. So for instance, a lot of studies about whether single-sex education works or not in Australia are biased by the sets of students who often select into or maybe get scholarships or have the money to go to those schools. Or, for instance, outcomes can be multi-directional. So a lot of studies will find that selective education is very, very good for the people who get it, but not very good or indeed actively bad for the people who miss out on it. So when a study kind of makes a big claim in either direction, you often might want to read a bit more deeply. Don't take things on face value, because very often people with particular agendas will take a study that maybe suggests something quite weakly and make a narrative out of it. All right, a couple of things I want to talk about on schools. The first thing I want to talk about, which I think is probably the majority of school-related debates, is stratification. So academic stratification is the term I'll use to describe education systems that separate students based on ability in really any way. So that could be things like streaming, so having different classes for students of different ability levels. It could be things like acceleration, whether that's individual accelerated classes or skipping grades. It could be things like selective schools or selective programs, gifted and talented programs, all of those things. There's lots of debates about these things. For instance, streaming on ability versus age, for instance, abolishing selective schools, for instance, having schools that are specialized to vocational education, really anything about giftedness, any choices you're making as a parent in an active debate, or just outright regretting stratification. There is an interesting literature review here for your perusal if for some reason you want to read it. All right, let's talk about whether or not stratification works. It's certainly a mixed bag. So the first thing I would just caveat here is obviously there are different types of stratification. Some of them seem to work better than others. So for instance, acceleration is pretty good. Like, it pretty straightforwardly increases outcomes, and the earlier you do it, the better. And streamed classes are pretty bad. They don't really have a particularly large good impact, if any. So it does depend, but there are a set of clear benefits to high-performing and gifted kids. Yes?
Sorry, what's the difference between acceleration and like streaming based on grades?
So streaming would be like in the same year, you have the top maths class and the bottom maths class and the two middle maths classes, but they're all like in year 8.
Yeah.
Whereas acceleration would be like you're doing the year up.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there's different kind of configurations of those, but that's the rough difference. So there's a set of benefits of these kind of programs that tends to show up in research. For instance, their learning pace and their learning needs are met. They're grouped with other high-performing and gifted kids, which does tend to have improved social outcomes, although sometimes they have an adjustment period. They get what's called the big fish, little pond effect, a real research term. They ideally are able to be taught by experienced teachers, and this is often important because a lot of HP and G kids are like twice exceptional, i.e. they have another, they're gifted, but they also have a disability, for instance. So it's quite, like, a lot of the potential of these sort of systems is only really attained when you have specialized teachers who are like HP and G aware. And one kind of final thing I would note, just if you ever need to do any weighing here, is when we think about underachievement among gifted students, it's I guess it's not unilateral. Like some gifted kids are more or less likely to underachieve than others, and by underachieve here just mean like not reach their potential, not necessarily get the outcomes we might have expected them to get. And overwhelmingly, kind of well-off gifted kids will kind of do fine regardless. They obviously have familial supports that help them to do that. But disadvantaged students, especially low socioeconomic status students, they are disproportionately likely to underachieve as gifted students. And that might be because they just straight up miss out on these kind of systems, but it also might be that those systems don't necessarily cater to them that well. Okay, so stratification definitely has benefits for high-performing and gifted kids, perhaps not across the board or perfectly, but I think there's a series of reasons why it very often does. With that said though, it's much less clearly beneficial on a system level. So there's trade-offs in terms of the broader education system. That's firstly, as I mentioned, there's an underrepresentation of low SES students in gifted programs. So you might make the claim that gifted programs just don't do a great job of really selecting for giftedness across the population, and they tend to be a pretty good proxy for things like wealth and for instance, having been tutored and so on. But also, it's, just setting that aside, seems to be reasonably poorly associated with having a high quality education system. So most of the best education systems have pretty low stratification, and on net, high stratification systems tend to perform worse, if you look at on a country to country level. And crucially, I don't think that that's necessarily predetermined. One really important consideration is that stratification can make lower achieving students achieve worse, because when you stratify people, the expectations on the lower achieving set of students reduce, in which case, obviously, they're gonna underperform. So there are obviously ways you could design systems to avoid that happening, but it is certainly a risk that needs to be considered. The final thing I'd note is that this is pretty complex. Like there are often multi-directional forces helping kids to do well, but then also making it hard for them to do well. So an interesting one, I think, is that there's this thing called academic self-concept, which is basically how kids think about themselves academically, how smart they think they are, what they think their likely chances of success and so on are. And interestingly enough, in systems with high levels of stratification, working class children have higher academic self-concepts than upper class children of the same ability level. And that's broadly because the people that they're surrounded by in a stratified system aren't, they perceive themselves to be performing better than them, whereas the kids who are higher achieving, for instance, but also rich, have more pressure on them by virtue of the way those stratified systems tend to work. So that means, you do, I guess, get a self-concept benefit. Like it is the case that working class children tend to feel better about their academic success than upper class children. But the drawback there is that in those highly stratified systems, they often then get selected into less ambitious career paths. So they feel better about themselves, they're more motivated, but because it's stratified and because they might be on a kind of lower career track, they don't necessarily make the most of it, even though they have a higher self-concept than peers of the same ability level. That's the paper if you want to read it, it's kind of interesting. Yes?
Just what exactly is the big fish little pond effect?
Yeah, so it's basically like, if you are a smart kid and you're the smartest in your grade, you feel really good about yourself. But then if you go into like a selective school, for instance, and everyone else is smarter than you, you feel like the little fish in the big pond is kind of what it is. Yeah, cool. And so I guess the final thing I'd say there is, I guess maybe the general insight that you could learn from that with respect to self-concept is like potentially having an academic environment that closely matches your ability could be something which is quite like academically empowering and makes kids feel, safe and have good self-concepts across the board. But again, obviously there's other things that intervene in that system, like wealth, that can change that. All right. Some things to think about in these sorts of debates. Firstly, I think a big question is just which types of students should we weight more? Like these debates often do obviously talk about aspects of disadvantage. And I mean, I think it's tricky because disadvantaged kids are often disproportionately impacted actually either way. So, disadvantaged kids might stand to benefit the most from things like selective schools, but also miss out on them the most. So it's somewhat unclear which of those two impacts we should care more about. And I think then we have to do more specific and more nuanced weighing. So we might, for instance, want to say, well, high potential students who are potentially very socially mobile and can make very large changes in their community or bring lots of change to their peers by example, might matter the most just because of that scale of impact. Or we might say, those kids will always be roughly fine even if they never achieve their potential. We should prioritize avoiding the worst outcomes, like kids just straight up not completing school, not being in employment, education, or training. The other thing which I think is useful to think about is what the baseline looks like. Like the characterization of the status quo, I think, is really important. So for instance, at WUDC, we set a topic that was about academic self-concept. It was like that education systems should attempt to artificially inflate kids' academic self-concept to make them view their academic potential or academic skill more positively than perhaps it really is. And I think a big task in that debate for either side is going to be creating a clear and compelling picture of how academically self-confident kids are now. Because obviously if they're maybe actually a bit too confident, then it's not useful to inflate it. But if you can prove successfully that they're lacking in confidence, or at least that a set of very important children are lacking in self-confidence, then it becomes quite important. And we want to do that, I think, with some specificity and some nuance. Like, we obviously don't want to be assertive about that. So some ways that we can impact this and really flesh it out for the adjudicator are things like, how does the way that people perceive themselves play into their ability to take academic risks? So that might be one explanation, for instance, about why there's a gender gap in performance in STEM subjects, is girls often have much lower confidence in their maths and science ability, and therefore are just less likely to take a punt in class and say an answer, try something out, because they feel very, very insecure about their ability there. So potentially, for that set of students, increasing their academic self-confidence or self-concept is very valuable. It could also be things like choice of subject. So if you, for instance, take that example, girls feeling uncomfortable in maths, maybe this is also something that just means people on net are more likely to do subjects that they're not necessarily that good at, but that are valuable for their lives, and that could be a good thing. It could also be things like the approach to feedback. So on the flip side, if you make kids too cocky, then maybe they don't listen to their teachers, and that is pretty bad, both on a learning level and also for the poor teachers. And then finally, it's things like class participation. How does this change the dynamics of the classroom? Are there particular students who are emboldened who otherwise would not be, or who are already emboldened and get too emboldened? So these kind of granular bits of analysis about what the classroom looks like, I think are quite useful to do, and hopefully, like, you've all been in a classroom pretty recently, so I think actually debaters are often quite good at doing this. All right, next thing I want to talk about is school choice. Here is the info slide from AWGMDC on the school choice motion that defines it, I think, quite nicely. So basically, school choice is the ideology that proposes that parents should have access to alternatives to public education, whether that's private, selective, religious, alternative schools. And then there are a series of policies that governments can do to empower that choice. So, for example, it could be things like government funding for private schools to make that an accessible choice for people. It could be things like tax concessions to schools, in places where schools are for profit, for providing additional scholarships. It could be things like relaxing the school district laws to make it easier to go to a school outside your area. It could be things like charter schools or school vouchers in the US. It could be things like making homeschooling easier. There's lots of options available to people, but in general, the claim, I guess, made by school choice is that parents have a series of important values regarding their kids' education, and we should give them a fair bit of autonomy to make choices about where their kids go to school and under what circumstances. All right, so a bunch of things to think about in these sorts of debates. First of all, I think it's useful to talk about the amount of buy-in that the system, like the education system has, because obviously parents' desire for their child to be educated in particular ways are often very, very strong. Particularly when we're thinking about like religious considerations, even like family traditions, stuff like that. They often mean a lot to parents, and they care very deeply about them, which makes these questions quite fraught, because it can mean, that if you don't allow parents this degree of choice, if you don't support parents in this way, there's quite a lot of backlash, or it undermines the education system. It means these parents feel like their kids are being indoctrinated. It means these parents are more likely to take their kid out of school altogether in some places, stuff like that. But on the other hand, obviously, there is some value to a degree of uniformity across the system, making sure everyone's learning the same curriculum, making sure people are graduating school literate and numerate. So there's obviously some degree of standardization, which is valuable. And that's, I think, an intricate trade-off that governments have to make. Secondly, inequality. I think this is a big question, especially when it comes to things like private schools. So, I think there's two questions here. The first being on a government level, how does the presence of things like private schools in the system impact government funding? The claim that private school advocates would make, like in Australia, would be, well, this actually takes a burden off the public school system because it means that the government has to fund these private schools less. But I guess the claim that other people might make is like, well, they still fund private schools too much. Much to say there. But I think also, more interestingly, I think that there's stuff to say about the kind of social inequality that occurs via things like private schools. So even if it saves government's money, perhaps it might be the case that putting people into silos where they don't really meet anyone from a different class is just generally quite bad and contributes to cycles of snobbery that are not good. Yeah.
How does the government divvy up funding between private and public schools?
Yeah, so I can tell you what it looks like in Australia. Basically, the federal government gives some funding to public schools and all funding to private schools. So any public funding that a private school gets comes from the federal government. And then the state gives most funding to public schools.
Yep.
And public school funding is then it's negotiated between the states and territories and the Commonwealth. It's quite a complex process of negotiation because obviously they both have kind of political promises around it. There's a thing called the school resourcing standard that is in the news at the moment if you want to keep an eye on it, which is basically about how much we think public schools should get, and different governments put certain amounts of different commitments into that. And the big controversy at the moment is that quite a lot of private schools are actually funded over the school resourcing standard, so they're at like 105% of their funding needs, whereas most public schools are not. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yep, sweet, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering like how this backlash from parents could like in a sense like if what they desire is not being fulfilled, how would they rebel against this or like
Yeah.
what is the impact?
I guess it probably depends like what education systems we're talking about. I think in some places it can look like actually just withdrawing kids from school, doing things like homeschooling more. But I think even where that's not the case, I think that there can be increases in demands on public schools, like on curricula. So for instance, if parents are very religious and they feel uncomfortable about kids being taught, for instance, sex ed or particular things about gender or like, I don't know, evolution, I guess, those kind of pressures can place a lot of lobbying pressure on curriculum boards and on the education system, which can be, I guess, kind of problematic in letting public schools be independent from that kind of stuff. But on the flip side, you might just say, well, we should just force people to learn those things. Too bad. So I think that's obviously arguments either way. Yeah.
Regarding public funding for private schools, what's the justification that the department gives for funding private schools?
Yeah. So basically, the justification is, well, I guess it depends. A couple of things I'd say. First, so there's, I guess, a couple of different, a scale or a spectrum of different types of private schools. So you might, for instance, want more funding to go to low fee, like private schools that only charge like $2,000 or $5,000 a year or whatever, versus independent schools that charge like $30,000. So I think there's some spectrum of financial need there. But I guess the broader rationale is like their parents are taxpayers. They also want their kids to have various benefits that the government can help provide. There's some funding needs at private schools. It's, I think, also political, like private schools don't like being defunded, so it's quite hard to do. Yeah. Cool. All right, some other considerations. I think there's some useful arguments to be made about diversity as well. Like I think you can just make a principled argument that it's important to allow people's values and identities and so on to be supported by their schools. Obviously, I think that's probably a limited principle. We would not do that infinitely, but I think it's certainly a principle you can make. There's recorded, the round on the school choice debate at AWGMDC is recorded. It's quite good. You can search it up on the internet. I judged it. It does, makes that argument quite skillfully, I think, so watch that if you want to see that. And then fourthly, you can make some economics claims about innovation and competition. So it might be worth thinking about whether the presence of different options in the school system places a beneficial or a detrimental pressure on the school system. Because on one hand, these might be things which firstly help to hold the public system to account. Like if the public system is failing and there's other things like charter schools which are showing it up, this can place kind of positive pressure on governments potentially to make good choices and to improve and get things into shape. or potentially it can be more innovative. So again, if you have things like charter schools or things like independent schools that are able to try out new curriculum choices, that can be quite a good thing. On the flip side, of course, I think you can make the claim that people don't really make super rational or super preference optimizing choices about education. They often do so on the basis of reputation, snobbery, stuff like that, in which case it's not clear that that would feed into pushing good competition or innovation in the system. Like if you can just get $40 million and build like a big library and then get a lot of parents come to you, then it doesn't necessarily incentivize super valuable choices on the part of these schools. So there's certainly, I think, an argument to make about which direction those sets of incentives goes in. All right, final thing I want to talk about under the schools is debates about curriculum choices. Some example topics would be schools should teach kids in their local community dialect. It could be one I did at HWS recently, which was we should abolish versus diversify the literary canon. It could be debates about history curricula and whether they should be revisionist in some way or teach post-colonial history or be really nationalist. There's a million versions of that history curriculum topic, but basically it's should we do the curriculum in a way which is political in X way? All of them basically, all of these debates are broadly about, I guess, the place of politics within the curriculum and how the curriculum should kind of intervene in society and reflect social needs, etc. So let's go through some of the common clashes in these debates. Firstly, I guess there's just the direct clash, which is the thing we're teaching good and useful? You might say, well, nationalist history is not very useful and we shouldn't teach it. So there's that immediate clash. That I won't go through in too much detail because I think it's debate specific and straightforward. Secondly though, I think it's always worthwhile to ask yourself if schools can teach it well. And the way to explain this is firstly maybe to flesh out what it looks like to teach the thing in the classroom, give some examples about what sorts of claims teachers would make, how they would go about doing it. But some other things to consider are is this something which kids and parents will find intuitive? Does it reflect community norms or values? Or does it seem really weird and is it something that people are struggling to buy into? Is it something that teachers will believe in, for instance, as well? And is it accessible? So, some of these history curricula being revisionist debates, I think you could just say this is not something that kids can grapple with or find tangible. It doesn't reflect their lived experience. It doesn't reflect the kinds of things they've heard from their grandparents their whole life, so they don't buy into it. So this kind of, can schools teach it well? How do kids internalize it? I think is really valuable. And doing that again in quite a granular way that reflects the way that people actually kind of access a classroom and how they think about it is useful. And then on the kind of backlash point we touched on earlier, I think you can do this here as well. So you can think about how parents and the broader community respond to these kind of narratives. Because if it's the case that there's a massive backlash and parents in the community get really mad because wokeness has gone nuts in our schools or whatever, that can meaningfully constrain a set of better and more important curriculum choices. So you might say, well, yeah, perhaps we can see that it might be lovely to tell these kind of stories in English class, but the problem is they're not that useful and they take away from our ability to do this much more important other thing, which we should prioritize with our limited capital instead. And then I think there's a task of weighing these things. So if we believe that this is broadly a good thing to teach in the curriculum, that kids could engage with well and that it could have a good social impact, but it will create a big social backlash, or it's something that teachers and parents will object to. So for instance, where social norms are changing quite rapidly and there's a generational, the generation's out of step, then there's a weighing question as well to talk about how risky schools should necessarily be, and maybe if kids can get these sorts of lessons from other sources. So can kids get this information from books or from the internet? Do we need schools to intervene in this way? What is the counterfactual as well? All right, I want to talk about tertiary education for a bit, and I'm going to start just, I guess, some framing on university and vocational education and the dichotomy between those two things, because there is, in the real world, quite a lot of controversy about what sorts of pathways we should be funneling students into, whether they should be higher education ones, university, or whether they should be vocational pathways, I guess things like TAFE, apprenticeships, traineeships, and so on. So the context here is that there has been a very large social investment across several countries in getting people to attend university. Some people have characterized this as the elite to mass to universal model, so elite being only elites go to university, think back in the 60s, etc. Mass being, we make it free, we encourage lots of people to go, and universal being, this is an expectation that the majority of the population will go to university. Whether that's a fair characterization up for debate, but certainly like a thing that people have thought about. And you know, as some examples of the way that we've funneled people into university, for instance, the federal government has a 20% target. That means that 20% of university students should belong to the bottom income quartile. So they have this target for low SES students, and they apply that to universities, and they do their best to get universities to do things like extend scholarships and have early entry programs and so on to low SES students. The Universities Accord final report, which was released recently, basically explicitly said not enough people currently go to university, and it introduced some targets to make even more people go to university. And in general, you can read this study, I guess, if you're interested. You don't have to. But you know, in general, research into the way that people think about university has suggested that there's lots of pressure for people to go to university, even where it doesn't necessarily relate to their career aspirations. It's seen increasingly as the default pathway, or as the pathway that you should kind of take most seriously, or that reflects the best life aspirations. And all of this has created a shift in the perceived role and purpose of university, partly in terms of the expectations on students, but maybe also in the way that universities work. Because obviously, if you've got a massive increase in the number of students, if your interests aren't necessarily as being perceived as elite, but also preparing people for the workplace and so on, that does change universities' relationships with students as well. Here are a few things to think about with respect to this dichotomy. Oh, sorry, the other thing I want to say, actually relatedly, is as this has happened, and as university has become this kind of thing that people view as default of being very important, vocational education has kind of fallen away in some ways. So participation in things like apprenticeships and traineeships has gone down. There's lots of shortages in like skills shortages in areas serviced by vocational education, and things like TAFE, you know, have been, like some people would say, underfunded, undermined, and so on. So I think that's the flip side, I guess, of the university phenomenon. So some things to think about here. Firstly, I think that one big challenge in kind of fixing this, or maybe saying maybe more people should be going into vocational pathways, maybe we shouldn't be forcing everyone to go to university, is the difficulty of identifying who should be where. Because obviously it seems undesirable to too strictly be like, you should go into vocational pathways, if that just means that we go back to the days when, like, if you were low SES, you did vocational, if you were rich, you went to university. That obviously would not be a good intervention in the system. And also, I think that there's a series of narratives and expectations about these things that we should be careful about. So you don't necessarily want it to be like, if you're smart, you go to university, and if you're not that academically gifted, you could go into vocational ed. You want it, I think, to be a bit more precise than that. And you want people to be making wise choices about where they go into, and doing these things as valid career pathways. So a solution that just changes the numbers of students going into each program could be insufficient if we don't think about who those students are and why they're making that choice. The second thing, though, is uni is very good. Like, going to university does increase people's income earning prospects pretty immensely. It is really good to have people from a variety of backgrounds at university. So the goal to get more people to go to university in many ways is a good one that we should like. So that creates, I think, a series of challenges for setting targets and configuring funding to balance these two concerns, to make sure that we do have people going into apprenticeships and traineeships, but that we're not precluding people from going to university if they want to. And one thing to think about here is potentially if integration between these two things is desirable. You can read this article if you're interested in that. But basically, some people would suggest that we should be encouraging students from as early as possible to be taking both vocational and academic style courses, and integrating those two things more and more. And I guess I would say as well, like, in some ways this is a return to the past, insofar as back in the day, things like TAFE were a much larger community program, and people would just like do TAFE courses for the hell of it. Like, I don't know, my uncle did, my grandpa did like a pottery TAFE course back in the day. Like, people just did that in the 70s. So in some ways this is a return to the past, but obviously maybe you would do the model differently. So that is just to say, lots of challenges delivering people into skill shortage areas reliably, lots of challenges getting people to do pathways that are good for them. I think those are kind of intuitive why that would be challenging, but like, there's a lot of debates about it and how much we should skew on employability and vocationality as opposed to university for university's sake. Cool. Let's talk quickly about the role of universities. I think there's some big debating topics about this. So, for instance, should universities focus on employability? Should the government subsidize socially useful subjects? Or, you know, I guess kind of, as I said, obliquely, debates about student movements, like what should the student experience be? What role does that play? So I'm going to start by talking about employability. This one's, I think, quite controversial. Universities have had this increasing, and not just universities, governments as well, have had this increasing focus on universities as a pathway into specific jobs. So, you know, that looks like the rise of vocational degrees that directly feed you into a career, and also perhaps a decrease in more kind of generalist degrees, like liberal arts degrees. But it also looks like things like partnerships with industry, interdisciplinary units, like I'm sure, you know, in the process of attending the University of Sydney, you've encountered some of this shit. And thirdly, it looks like the way that governments go about things. So for instance, the previous government implemented a thing called the Job Ready Graduates Bill. It had a higher education support amendment bill, but it's called the Job Ready Graduates. And basically that changed the amount of the costs for different courses to try and incentivize people into particular courses. It did that in a relatively ineffective way. We can go into why it's ineffective in a bit, but like I'll flag, it didn't really work that well. But obviously the desire there seems to be to make university education into a fundamentally career-based thing. And I think there are certainly some arguments for doing that. Like, first of all, it might be a really financially good choice. Firstly, for students. So for students who are on the precipice of deciding to go to university, being quite sure that it will get you a job might be the tipping point. If you aren't, you know, if your choice is to go straight into work, knowing that you can get a job can be really, really meaningful. It also might be good for universities, like these kind of industry partnerships, as cringe as they might seem, could be good sources of income for universities. Universities can be cash-strapped, so you know I don't think we should necessarily be too quick to judge. And also it might be good for the economy as a whole. Like if we're funneling people into things that are employable and they get employed, that obviously creates a series of economic benefits, although that is, I think, contingent on successfully funneling people into things that are employable. I think though that there are some arguments against it as well. So I think, you know, often it is just not done very well. You know, it's done in ways that are tokenistic, or it's done in ways that are just badly taught. Like if you do an interdisciplinary impact unit, it doesn't necessarily feel that job applicable because the uni is just like doing it as a branding exercise. Sorry, you said, but you know, like that's what it is, right? And also, like, you know, we don't always know what skills areas might be. So for instance, a lot of skills initiatives kind of don't like the arts industry, even though the arts industry needs people, like it has a bunch of skill shortages that we should feel like. So there are obviously biases and problems that go into that kind of thing. But thirdly, I think you might just say like it undermines something really important about university. Like university should also be an academic exercise that feeds into research, that makes people smarter and more worldly. And if we just focus on getting people jobs, they don't necessarily get this kind of more generalist education that used to be a very core part of universities. Finally though, I would just ask whether incentives to be employable necessarily work. They often don't. And the reason for that is people just don't necessarily have enough information to make that choice. And obviously, if you're really incentivized to become an engineer, but you hate maths, you're still not going to do it, so it doesn't make a difference. So oftentimes interventions to change people's preferences need to happen a lot earlier than the point of funding university degrees, because if you dropped out of maths in year 9, that's going to make no difference whatsoever for you. And then finally, I guess in the Australian context, HECS weighs into this, because if you're not going to pay it back for ages, it's not that meaningful. And so we don't notice a lot of changes in students' patterns of education when things get more expensive. They just have more debt, which is sad for them, but like doesn't do that much on an economic level. All right, I want to quickly talk about the student experience. A couple of comments. As I flagged, with the move to universal higher ed, we obviously have a lot more students, and we've also had the decline, I guess, of a kind of elite image of university, which I think is interesting. Like I think that has a series of dynamics you can talk about in debates. But it coincides with a different decline, which is, I would say, the decline perhaps of campus life. You know, you can come talk to me at the social if you want to hear about this. But like, I think that for a lot of reasons, universities have declined as a place where, if you imagine back in the 60s and 70s, people gathered, people went to the pub all the time, people were just chilling, it was crazy. And the reason for that is like the cost of living was lower, people didn't really feel pressure to have a job, people were part of youth movements that maybe have died off a bit now. But I think there's an interesting question as to whether universities play a good or potentially a problematic role in, as a site of social change and as a site of identity formation for young people. And I think there are questions of like whether or not we should facilitate more of that, or indeed whether it's just elitist and people should just, graduate and get a job and get over themselves. Lots to think about. All right, we have like 7 minutes left. I'm going to talk about academia mega quickly, but I'll take a question first.
Just a question on elitism, because I kind of have this experience within the healthcare faculty where there isn't almost any sense of elitism. So is that more of a broader problem relating to faculty? Looking from a nursing perspective.
Good question. I don't know. I think like the claim I would make is probably depends university to university. Like I think there's in Australia quite a big divide between research and teaching universities, group of 8 universities who get a shit ton of funding and have a lot of reputation. Like you said, I think this kind of snobbery is not very present in regional universities so much. And I imagine it also depends on faculty. Like I suspect people in a vocational degree have less of an incentive to be like really elitist about it. And I think that universities also participate in these kind of things as branding exercises as well. So I think that it's definitely like multivalent, I guess. Cool. All right, let's talk about academia. So I want to start with teaching. So academics do a lot of different things. The 3 important things that academics want to talk about are teaching, research, and administration. And if you hear the phrase 40-40-20, it'll be about that. What it means is they want to spend 40% of the time teaching, 40% of the time researching, and 20% of the time doing administrative labor. And over time, this 40-40-20 balance has been undermined. If you look at all of the EBA negotiations that happened like 2 years ago, this was a really big deal for academics. And the reason for that is that research, matters a lot to academics as a kind of personal and professional thing. It, is obviously their research interest is often why they got into being an academic as opposed to some other thing. And also in their, in the way that they describe it, matters a lot to students insofar as teaching becomes better if academics are genuinely experts and genuinely specialists. But universities often don't want to pay that much for academics doing all this research time. And so that leads to a variety of things. Firstly, it looks like trying to change this balance, but it also looks like things like creating teaching-only positions, very controversial proposal. And that faces a lot of hostility from academics because they feel like it's undermining the 40-40-20 balance. It's bringing people in to do what is not in a traditional sense like what the academic position looks like, and is often very casualized as well, I would say. But I would also note that there's big questions of funding here as well, because the funding settings in the higher education sector place a lot of pressure on universities to make a quick buck. So universities, for instance, have to extract a lot of money from international students to subsidize things like research, and even to subsidize domestic students if they're underfunded by the federal government. So there's big questions about the way that the funding settings that universities are operating in changes their behavior. Relatedly, I want to talk about the trend of corporatization, which many people have identified in universities, both in Australia and around the world. Most recently, the University of Board report. If you're keen on the university sector, you should read it. So there's a couple of key features about this. Firstly, it looks like more managerialism in universities. So back in the day, the people who ran universities tended to be academics. Like they were academics who got pretty good at their jobs and got promoted. And they, they weren't always well liked and they didn't always act in work ways, but they were fundamentally academics. These days, the management of universities is much more managerial, much more corporate style. You often have business experts who come in who aren't particularly from the field of academia. UCIT's current vice chancellor is doesn't have a real postgrad degree, it's crazy. That would never happen back in the day. And so that's quite a big change, I guess, the way that universities are run. But it also looks like things like the casualization of staff. So more and more staff being employed on a term-to-term basis, which is a very big change from back in the day when people would be tenured and they would feel, they'd be able to potter around doing research for a long amount of time, which sounds awesome. So I understand why they feel bad about it and fighting. And that creates a variety of impacts. On one level, it creates things like strikes, which are very big in the higher ed sector. There's a bunch that have happened in the last couple of years in Australia, but also the UCU strikes in the UK. But also, importantly, it creates things like attrition in academia. It means that researchers don't want to stay in academia, particularly when they can go get lucrative research jobs outside of universities. So that's a really important consideration when we think about where talent is distributed and that kind of thing. I'm going to skip this, but I'll give you the slides if you want. One thing I quickly want to talk about is how we value research funding, because I think this is a useful nuance in explaining academics' incentives as they do research, and grounds some problems with research that you might want to talk about in debates, which I won't have time to get into. There are three broad ones. The first and most traditional is the H index, which is calculated by counting the number of publications for which an author has been cited by authors that have at least that amount of citations. So if you have an H index of 17, you've been cited by 17 authors who have 17 citations. And this creates basically a pressure to publish a lot, because the more you publish, the more citations you're likely to get. It places pressure on academics to yield publishable conclusions, because they want to publish a lot, they want other people to cite them. And it can crucially reward incumbents over innovation. So things that are recognizable, things that are likely to be appreciated by people who are already in that field, as opposed to more innovative ideas, tend to get rewarded by this system. And this is understandable insofar as if I'm a government and I want to use taxpayer money wisely and give grants to people, I likely do want to minimize the risk of research not delivering results. But obviously the problem with that is it can create pressures to, I think, be quite manipulative, for instance, with data. It can create pressures to do poor quality research at the expense, of more detail or being a bit slower and so on. This has, there's been two kind of evolutions given that problem. The first is to take into account impact factors. So grants increasingly take into account other factors than just number of citations. So that's things like obtaining peer-reviewed grants. It's things like outcomes of patents, things like public policy implications, invitations to conferences, prizes, awards. The problem with all of this, of course, is that it can just grandfather in the inequalities I've just talked about. So if it's the case that you initially got a bunch of conference invitations from having studies with a bunch of citations, it doesn't really fix the problem. But also there's, I think, a series of pretty obvious barriers to entry to these things, which can mean that researchers ultimately are still rewarded for doing things that are likely to get funded and likely to get recognized. Finally, alt metrics. So this is another attempt to kind of broaden calculations. And it does vary, like there are lots of different kind of alt metrics programs, I guess. But it could be things like, if your publication count is reduced by you being a parent, taking that into account. It could be things like the amount of time that you've spent in industry roles. It could be things like social media impact of your study. And the idea of that is to try and be more reflective of the kind of true quality of research. Finally, I think it's worth then also thinking about the incentives of the people funding universities, whether they're people like governments, and maybe their incentives to be risk averse, or whether they're people like philanthropists. They may be less risk averse, but certainly less sustainable or a bit more happy to root around their money to maximize impact. And then finally, you should think about how this research then feeds into policy. If the sorts of arguments we're making is that, currently we're prioritizing incumbency over innovation, or we're creating a quite stifling consensus in academia, how does that then carry over into public policy? All right, 6. So I'll wrap up. But feel free to get my slides. I'm happy to talk to you about this. And if you have any questions, let me know. Good luck, everyone.